Imagine this. You're a fighter pilot. The enemy is helpless, right in your sights. One pull of the trigger makes you a hero. Your country gives you its highest medal. But you see the faces of the dying men inside their broken machine. And you remember a rule that says you fight to win, not to slaughter. What do? On December 20th, 1943, a German ace named Franz Stigler faced that exact choice. This is the true story of the day an enemy became a guardian angel, and a decision that proves your character isn't defined by the battles you win, but by the ones you refuse to fight. December 20th, 1943, Bremen, Germany. The winter sun sits low, a dull coin under a blanket of cloud. The light is gray, sharp, and without warmth. Frost clings to the aluminum seams of the B-17 flying fortress named WWII pub. The air, thin and frigid at 27,000 feet, tastes of iron and burned cordite. The bomber rattles through the sky. Vibrations buzz at the teeth. The floor shivers under boots, slick with hydraulic fluid and blood. Wind roars through open seams in the fuselage, a blade of cold at the back of the throat. On the instrument panel, amber lights flicker dimly. Oxygen masks, lifelines in this thin air, hang ragged. Somewhere aft, the raw smell of hot, sweet oil mixes with the acrid scent of ozone from frayed electrical cables. Flak bursts thump the air, hollow booms like doors slamming in a long, empty corridor. Arcs of tracer fire stitch their way upward, pass, and then return with renewed fury. Inside the cockpit, a young pilot blinks away the blackness creeping in at the edges of his vision. Second Lieutenant Charlie Brown, a 21-year-old from West Virginia on his first mission as aircraft commander, grabs the yoke with hands that don't feel like his own. His gloves are soaked and tacky with a mixture of sweat and fluid. He tastes copper. With a strength born of desperation, he steadies the dive. The B-17, a wounded giant, skips in the sky like a stone losing momentum on a lake. The altimeter unwinds, down, down, then hesitates as he pulls back with all his might. The nose fights him, a stubborn beast wanting only to meet the earth. He coaxes what little power is left from the straining engines, his breath ragged through a split lip. He scans his instruments, a litany of failures. Engine number 2 is dead, silenced by a direct hit. Engine number 4 still turns but coughs and sputters, its temperature needle deep in the red. The electrical system is a chaotic mess of erratic lights and unreliable fuel gauges. The hydraulics are bleeding out, making control a constant struggle. Oxygen is intermittent, forcing the crew to gasp for air. The plexiglass nose is gone, shattered by flak, and the winter air knifes through the opening, turning every breath into a needle of ice. He can't hear his own voice over the wind's deafening roar. The interphone crackles with fragments of communication, names, desperate check-ins, and whispered prayers. The bomber's cheerful name, WWII pub, feels like a cruel joke now. The fuselage has been ripped open like a tin can, exposing torn ribs of aluminum, jagged and bright as a butcher's hooks. Frayed fabric slaps against the torn frame like pennants that have lost their meaning. Propaganda posters showed the flying fortress as an invincible war machine, flying in tight, neat boxes, guns bristling in all directions, with smiling crews holding coffee cups. The reality over Bremen was a brutal counterpoint. 9 of the 11 machine guns on WWII pub were inoperative, some jammed, others shot away. The tail position, a critical defensive post, was eerily quiet. The crew knew what that silence meant. The tail gunner, Sergeant Hugh Ecky Eckenrode, was not answering their calls. Blood had frozen into a dull varnish on the floor plates near the waist, a grim testament to the ferocity of the attack. The fortress was bleeding, yet somehow it still flew. The plane lurches again, a violent shudder that threatens to tear it apart. Brown tightens his grip, his knuckles white. He imagines the ground rushing up to meet them, black fields, the hard, final thud, the ugly twist of metal. He feels the dive pulling them down again and hauls back on the yoke, coaxing the shuddering bird toward level flight. He gets it to hold. The airspeed stabilizes, a fragile heartbeat that has decided, for now, to keep beating. Then a shadow slips alongside, a shape in the corner of his eye, slender, dark-nosed and shark-like, a Messerschmitt Bf-109, so close that its wings fill his side window. The German pilot is bareheaded under the canopy, his oxygen mask off. Brown's stomach plummets. This is how it ends. A lone, crippled bomber, a German ace on its wing. The script for this encounter was written in blood and fire across the skies of Europe. If you're already hooked by this moment in history, do me a favor and hit that like button. It tells the YouTube algorithm that stories about character and impossible choices are what men want to see. It helps us build a community that values these forgotten acts of integrity. Thanks, guys. Now, let's find out who these two men were. Who they were before the sky, before this brutal winter sky, before the smell of hot oil and the sting of frost. There was West Virginia, 1922. Charles L. Brown was a farm boy with a mechanic's instinct in his hands, a strong back, and good eyes. By 21, he had learned flight manuals by heart and the shape of a runway by feel. He was earnest, quiet, and very young. RAF Kimbolton in December was a landscape of cold mud and Quonset huts rhymed with frost, where the coffee was always lukewarm. He was part of a crew stitched together by training, jokes, and the kind of trust that can't be faked, because the sky punishes pretense. This was his first mission as pilot in command, the first time leading his men into the frozen corridors of enemy air. He carried the weight of their lives on his shoulders, a burden he was only just beginning to understand. On the other side of the long arc of Europe, in Regensburg, 1915, Franz Stigler was born into a world that would change twice before he reached the age of 30. His father had been a pilot in the First World War, and by 12, Franz was riding thermals in gliders, learning to read the air like water. He became an instructor, then a combat pilot, precise where others were merely bold. He could fly by feel and by mathematics, watching a slip of cigarette paper tremble in a draft to know his aircraft's trim. By 1943, he was an ace with 27 victories, just one short of the coveted Knight's Cross. He knew his tally like a man who keeps careful accounts, but he also kept another ledger, a private one, taught to him by his commander, Gustav Rödel. You follow the rules of war for you, not for your enemy. You fight by rules to keep your humanity. Do not shoot a man in a parachute. Do not lose the last piece of yourself that belongs to you. The air war of 1943 was a machine that ground men into numbers. Bomb groups rose in the dark, their engines a drumming wave of sound. They stacked into tight boxes, navigated across the North Sea, and flew into flak corridors plotted by German engineers with map pins and cold mathematics. The casualty rates were not just statistics on a page, they were odds you carried in your throat. A crewman's chance of surviving 25 missions was a coin flip. The Luftwaffe's doctrine was efficient and ruthless. Punish stragglers, cripple the isolated, and finish the damaged. The Luftwaffe rewarded numbers. There was a script for how to win and how to live long enough to write your tally on the chalkboard. Rödel's injunction was out of step with the prevailing propaganda, but not with an older memory of chivalry. War had rules once, he would say. You keep them, so you can recognize yourself in the mirror after the guns go quiet. Stigler had heard this as a young pilot and filed it away, not knowing when it would be called upon. It was a piece of moral hardware he carried, as essential as his compass, but far more difficult to use. 3. The Mission Brief, Deck 20, 1943. The briefing at RAF Kimbolton on the morning of December 20th was brisk and cold. The objective was Bremen, the Focke-Wulf aircraft factory, and the city's industrial nerves. The route was plotted on a large wall map with black thread. The expected flak belts were highlighted, line after line of intense, accurate, heavy. The formation plan was a study in disciplined geometry, boxes and altitudes, radio codes. The instructions were clear. If you get separated, rejoin. If you can't rejoin, turn for home and trust the piece of sky you can make for yourself. There was a professional calm in the room, the kind men adopt when the job is dangerous and complaining about it is a waste of oxygen. Takeoff was a symphony of breath plumes and engine notes building from a bark to a thunderous roar. The runway was slick, and the tires bit with a hiss. The cheerful nose art on Ye Olde pub seemed incongruous with the grim reality of their mission. Inside, the crew's chatter ran on well-worn rails, oxygen checks, weapon safeties, fuel states. A waist gunner kept a lucky coin in his glove. The navigator patted his map as if it were a nervous dog. Brown felt the thin margins of their chances. The winter light was weak, and the air was the kind that magnified error. It promised nothing. It was just a job, another day at the office, except the office was 5 miles high and full of men trying to kill you. They climbed, leveled off, and settled into the drone that could make a mind wander in unhelpful ways if allowed. Brown kept his focus tight, his flying steady. He did not yet know what kind of pilot he would be when the sky turned against him. He was about to find out. The North Sea passed below, a cold, gray sheet of metal, indifferent to the dramas playing out above it. The German coast appeared as a faint, dark line on the horizon, the edge of a world where every man on the ground was an enemy. 4. Contact. Bremen. Flak. Fire. Freefall. Over Bremen, the air grew crowded with deadly intention. The first flak bursts were black blossoms at the edges of their vision. Then they bracketed the formation with a mathematician's confidence. The B-17 shuddered as shrapnel bit and hammered its skin. A second later, the nose plexiglass blew out with a sound like a bell shattered into cold dust. Wind slammed into the cockpit. Brown tasted blood. He heard someone curse softly, almost politely, and then the radio broke into a cacophony of cries and checks. Engine number 2 took a direct hit. It coughed, protested, and died. Engine number 4 was wounded. It ran, but the gauges told a truth of their own. Not for much longer. Electrical lines fried in little pops of blue-white light. Hydraulic fluid ran in thin, slick streams. Oxygen lines ruptured. Men tore at their masks to clear them, then held them back to their faces, hoping for a trickle of life-giving air. The smell was a chemical sweetness edged with fear. 9 of the 11 guns went silent. A shattered mount, a feed jam, a gunner's hand too cold to work the belt after taking a piece of metal through his glove. The ball turret no longer tracked. The tail remained quiet. The radio operator tried to reach the tail gunner, then stopped trying. Brown called out again anyway. The answer never came. Sergeant Eckenrode was gone. A dozen German fighters chose the weakest lamb on the edge of the herd. They attacked in 4s, in 8s, from high noon and 5 and 7 o'clock. The B-17 was slow now, falling behind, and that was a death sentence. The crew worked their jobs with a grim determination. The engineer counted rounds with a kind of prayer. The navigator kept a pencil that would be soaked in red by the time they were done. Brown's co-pilot gave him the looks that pilots trade when words fail. They pushed through the bomb run because that was still their purpose. They dropped their payload on Bremen. The hangars were a geometry of dull roofs below. The city had spires and chimneys. The bombs fell, an act that could not be taken back. Then the sky extracted its payment. More fighters, more flak. The plane shook itself apart until it decided it wouldn't. Not yet. The nose dipped. The ground rose. The crew yelled to bail out. Brown looked at them, at what was left of his plane. Some of them wouldn't survive the fall. One of them already hadn't. He did the grim math. He would. Keep them in the air. He leveled her out barely above the rooftops, less than 300 meters above a winter city that did not care who he was. He pulled, and the fortress answered grudgingly. The dive stopped. The horizon found itself again. The doctrine was clear on both sides. Finish the cripples, do not let them limp home to fight another day. But humanity is also clear when you can see the whites of another man's eyes. The two were about to meet. We are diving deep into the kind of story that gets lost in the history books. If you believe these moments of profound humanity deserve to be remembered, hit that subscribe button. We don't just talk about battles here, we talk about the men who fought them and the choices that defined them. Join us for more stories like this. 5. The Interceptor, Stigler's Dilemma. On the ground, at a refueling airfield, a Bf-109 waited, its tanks full of fuel and its guns loaded with ammunition, ready to add to a score. Franz Stigler heard the scramble order. He snapped his harness tight and fed the throttle. The plane surged forward, tail up, then wheels up, the runway falling away behind him. He climbed into the cold, his eyes scanning for the bomber formation, for stragglers, for the easiest conversion of risk to tally. The work had its habits. You looked for a gap. You looked for smoke. You listened to your own engine for any hint of betrayal. He saw the B-17 immediately. It was limping, low and exposed, a sitting duck. He moved in behind it, his index finger already feeling for the trigger stud. He expected to see the usual, guns alive, the turret tracking, a fortress daring him to try. Instead, as he slid alongside, he saw the inside of the plane. He saw bandages. He saw faces etched with fear and exhaustion. He saw a shell of aluminum torn open so wide he could look into it like a cross-section of a model in a classroom. He saw a man slumped where the tail gunner should be, busy and loud. He saw another man dragging himself by his elbows across the floor. He saw frost on the edges of frozen blood, like sugar on a rim. These weren't soldiers anymore. They were survivors clinging to a wreck. It was like seeing a man dangling in a parachute harness, turning slowly in the winter light. Rodel's voice arrived not as a memory, but as a presence. Follow the rules for yourself. Shooting a parachutist is a death sentence. Stigler's finger rested where it would live if he were only a soldier. His other hand gripped the stick. One more victory, and the Knight's Cross would be a line in a letter home. One more, and the ledger would look tidy. But another voice spoke, quieter, older. If you do this, who are you now? This wasn't combat. This was an execution, and he was a fighter pilot, not an executioner. He took his hand off the trigger. The Bf-109 held its position, so close that the American crew could see the pilot's jaw, the shape of his mouth as he shouted words the wind carried away. Pointed down, signaling for them to land. He pointed east, toward Germany. He gestured with his head to the north. Sweden, neutrality, survival. His eyes met Brown's across a pane of cold air. They did not share a language, but the hands of pilots are a language both of them had learned before their beards filled in. 6. The Escort. Through the guns, Brown didn't trust miracles. He trusted checklists and angles. A German fighter alongside was a puzzle with teeth. Why wasn't he firing? Why did he look like a man giving instructions? The crew yelled ideas through the interphone like a storm of nails. Sweden would mean internment. Germany was not an option. Home was west, across the North Sea, across more cold, across the possibility that the engines were performing the last trick they had before they quit for good. He was the commander, and the decision was his. He would take his men home or die trying. He held his course. The Bf-109 stayed with them, shoulder to shoulder, a wolf playing the role of a sheepdog on the say-so of a conscience that wasn't supposed to have a vote. Stigler understood that the flak crews below would hesitate if they saw a German fighter guiding a bomber. They would assume a trap, a capture, a ruse. He tucked in tight, so close that the fortress's ruined skin glinted in his canopy. They flew over the edge of Germany, where the coast looked like a long-held breath. Below them, guns that had memorized trajectories and lead angles did not fire. The gesture of formation became a shield. For a few critical minutes, a German ace was using his own aircraft as a piece of armor for an American bomber. At the lip of the land, where Europe cracks into the North Sea, Stigler looked across the gap one last time. His face was a study in a decision already made. He straightened his wings, raised a hand, and gave a brief salute. It was not a cinematic flourish. It was the smallest acknowledgment that the rules he lived by had just forced him into an act of treason. He veered away, rolled, and disappeared to the east, back toward a war that counted deeds and not motives. He was flying back to a reality where his act of mercy could get him stood up against a wall and shot. 7. Crossing water. Silence and return. Inside Ye Olde pub, there was no cheering, just the slow triage of systems and people. Brown carefully reduced power, nursing engine number 4 as if it were a stubborn mule that would go if you talked to it right. The navigator drew a line across the water and guessed at the wind drift. The air was wet and smelled of salt now, less razored than the continental cold. The crew spoke softly, like men in a hospital ward at night. They counted the wounds they could name and ignored the ones they couldn't. The silence of the departed German fighter was as loud as the flak had been. It was the sound of a question they couldn't answer. They found England like a memory you use again and again until it gets thin at the edges, but still holds. They set down at RAF Seething, the wheels meeting the runway with a sigh that felt like an apology. The ground crews ran on instinct, pointing and shouting. They saw the holes. They saw the missing gun barrels. They saw the blood, dried dark and glossy. They counted the living. 1 KIA, several wounded. A plane that by any calculation should have been a cold shape at the bottom of the North Sea now sat steaming on a friendly strip, as if it had merely had a bad day. The formalities began. Debriefs were brisk and clipped. Men in uniforms asked for times and headings and fuel states. Brown said little about the shadow that had spared them. He watched how the story skidded in the minds of the men with clipboards. He read the order in their faces before it was spoken. Do not talk about this. Do not suggest that mercy might sometimes arrive in the wrong uniform. Crews must not expect the enemy to grow soft. Softness gets men killed. Silence was policy. He nodded. He was 21 and knew how orders worked. 8. The order to forget. Decades of night. On the other side of the lines, Stigler continued to fly. He flew Bf-109s and later the Me-262 jet, a machine that gulped sky and fuel and had the future in its bones. He did not speak of the day he escorted a wounded fortress to the lip of safety. To speak of it would be to invite a trial. The word for what he did would not be mercy in the mouths of men who tallied kills in chalk. It would be cowardice or treason. War punishes private morality when it gets in the way. He swallowed the story. The war ended. Germany broke and learned a new grammar under other people's rules. In 1953, Stigler left Europe for Canada. He became, like so many men of his generation, a peacetime immigrant with skills that did not fit neatly into peacetime boxes at first. He worked, he married, he built a life in a country with a winter light that sometimes, if you squinted, looked like the light above Bremen. He did not become a headline. He remained a man who had made a choice and lived with its silent consequences. Brown also moved on. He carried survival as a strange weight that seemed to get heavier in the quiet moments. There were nights. There were abrupt awakenings. There were dreams where the sound of wind was a message he couldn't decode. He returned to flying, eventually serving in the newly established U.S. Air Force until 1965. He did not speak publicly about the incident for years. The order to forget was once official. Over time, it became a habit he kept for himself, because he wasn't sure what the world would do with the detail that the enemy had spared him. Context changes. The war became documentaries and book covers. The Cold War layered another kind of fear over the old one. Men raised families and learned to talk about the past without feeling like they were showing off or confessing. They grew older. Their hands stopped shaking when they spoke certain names, or the shaking only happened on the inside, where it didn't show. The silence held for over 40 years. 40 years is a long time to carry a story like this. If you've ever held on to a memory that defined you, you know what that feels like. We're building a channel for men who understand that kind of weight. Hit subscribe and become part of a community that doesn't shy away from the tough stories. 9. Searchlight, Letter and Meeting, 1990. In 1986, Brown finally told the story. Maybe he was tired of holding it. Maybe he finally wanted to say the part that had kept him awake, that a German pilot had looked him in the eye and refused to turn him into a statistic. He began to search. He wrote to newsletters that veterans read with their morning coffee. He asked if anyone knew a Luftwaffe pilot who had escorted a crippled B-17 on December 20th, 1943, out of Bremen toward the North Sea. He included details no one else would know, the small fingerprints of truth. Engine number 2 destroyed, number 4 damaged, 9 of 11 guns gone, the tail gunner KIA, the flight so low over the city that he could see rooftops clearly, a Bf-109 forming up to starboard and refusing to fire. On January 18, 1990, a letter arrived. "I was that pilot." The words were simple, the handwriting steady, the name Franz Stigler. He remembered the same ragged shape of the B-17. He remembered the bandages. He remembered thinking that to shoot would be like shooting a man in a parachute. He remembered the winter air and the look in the other pilot's eyes. Brown called him. They compared details. The grid of memory clicked into place. The altitude, the coastline, the motions of hands and wings. Both men felt an old air moving again. They met in the summer of 1990 in Florida in a heavy heat and sunshine that could not be more different from that winter over Bremen. Brown walked toward a stranger who wasn't a stranger. Stigler had white in his hair and carried himself with the balance of a man who had learned it long ago. They embraced. There was no ceremony attached. They were not actors in a reconciliation program. They were two pilots who had shared fewer than 30 minutes of air and who had been carrying each other's faces in their private archives for nearly half a century. They began to tell their story together at schools, veterans' halls, and air shows where the distant hum of piston engines still turned heads. Stigler would say that saving that bomber was the one thing he could be proud of in a war that demanded so much and so often rewarded the wrong things. Brown would say that his crew lived because an enemy refused to follow the script. They called each other brothers. The word was not sentimental when they used it. It was descriptive. The culture listened. The book A Higher Call took their story and set it in clean prose for people who were not yet born when the sky over Bremen was complicated with metal. The band Sabaton wrote the song No Bullets Fly, which condensed a winter's day into a marching rhythm and a powerful chorus. Videos went around the world, short films, reenactments, animations, the internet doing what it does when it finds a story that contains dignity without preaching. Men watched on their lunch breaks and felt something they did not expect to feel before they went back to work. 10 Legacy, Refrain and Epiphany Awards appeared as the world learned to recognize small decencies with public symbols. In 1993, Stigler was presented with the Star of Peace by the Combatants Federation of Europe. The medal stood for what the day in 1943 had already made clear, that keeping your humanity inside a machine designed to erase it is a victory that does not fit on a chalkboard tally. It is not a statistic. It is a decision, repeated in a single second, and then defended for decades by silence and then by words. By 2008, both men were old. They died within months of each other, as if the timing of their last takeoffs would be coordinated even at the end. The story they had tended had become bigger than memory. It had become a way to ask a question. What do you fight for when fighting has rules, and propaganda insists that rules are for the defeated? The answer, even if it is not said out loud, is that you fight to keep the part of yourself that you can be proud of later, when there are no more uniforms in your closet. Men of a certain age, men who have taken risks and carried payrolls and mortgages and gravel in their shoes, watch this story and recognize the shape of a decision under pressure. The details are specific to the sky of 1943, but the conflict is as common as a tight deadline or a hard conversation with a son. You want to win, and there are rules you promised yourself you'd keep, even when nobody is watching. The currency is different. Aircraft aluminum instead of spreadsheets, but the math is familiar. Your tally grows if you squeeze the trigger. Your character shrinks if you do. It is possible to be efficient and wrong. It is possible to be brave and small. The world rarely offers points for choosing the thing that doesn't translate to a headline. So, look again at the opening image. December 20th, 1943. Bremen's winter light, iron in the air, a B-17 butchered and somehow flying, inches above rooftops it was never meant to see so close. A German fighter pulls up and holds station, steady as a hand under an elbow. On the ground, men stare up and wonder what they're seeing. Some think strategy, some think mistake. One man knows, this is what it looks like when a rule survives its test. Walk away with this. You will be asked to trade a piece of yourself for a neat result. You will be asked to move quickly, to squeeze, to push through, to look away from the person and at the numbers. The day will come when you have to decide not to do it. You will have to hold formation beside something broken and shepherd it past the guns that want it to fall. No one will give you a medal right then. The reward is that later, when the counting is over and you are left with your own face in the mirror, you can say the same thing Stigler said. That one act, that day, is what I can be proud of. And if you need a closing picture, set it where we began. Winter, light on aluminum, the smell of iron and cordite. 2 hands, one on a battered yoke, one on a fighter's stick, doing the same job from opposite sides, keeping something alive when the machinery of the world wants it dead. In that thin air, on that thin line above a city at war, 2 enemies redrew the sky into a different kind of map. No borders, just a corridor wide enough for mercy to pass through once, and for the rest of us to remember that it is possible.